Hello, hello, hello. Happy Easter. Welcome to the show. Today, Labour. We've got to talk about this, haven't we? It's 1 year on. So we can either avoid it, ignore it, pretend it's not a thing, or we can have I think it's going to be a thoughtful discussion about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party a year after his resounding victory in the leadership contest. Oof. Oh boy, where are we going to begin with this one? So we've got two fantastic guests I will bring in shortly, but I'm just going to set the scene. Let's set the scene, shall we? So clearly Labour suffered a brutal shellacking, if that's a term we use in British politics, not normally, but in the 2019 election. And in the rubble of defeat, a traumatised Labour Party had a leadership contest in which Keir Starmer came on top with over 50% of the vote, winning on the first preferences. Now, if we were going to distill his platform, what did Keir Starmer stand for in that leadership contest? I think it's very clear what he stood for. It was to retain the core domestic radical policies of the Corbyn era, but combine it with competence, party unity, and electability. And I think all of those are important to point out because, take unity. I think it was definitely the case that lots of people from all wings of the Labour Party just felt exhausted by the forever war of internal Labour politics. People clearly on the electability point were pretty fed up and traumatised by a devastating Conservative victory and what that meant for them, for the country as a whole. They wanted to kick the Tories out. What is the point, of course, of being in politics if you don't want to replace the Tories with a viable alternative government? And, they kind of felt that, I think a lot of people felt, well, look, he doesn't have the baggage of Jeremy Corbyn. How could the media possibly destroy Sir Keir Starmer, former director of public prosecutions? Simply wouldn't have the same impact, those media attacks. Where are we a year later? In terms of let's just go back, in fact. So what Keir Starmer said during the leadership contest. I think we've got a clip of what he said.
The fundamental shift in our policy from 2015 to 2017 and then to 2019 to a more radical politics was the right fundamental shift. Big issues like being a party of anti-austerity, being a party that wants to invest in our public services and in manufacturing. Really important shifts, and I'm very concerned that as we move forward, we don't either trash the last Labour government or trash the last 4 years.
Yeah, so the 10 pledges he stuck by were, for example, to increase taxes on big business and the rich, the top 5%. It was to scrap tuition fees. It was common ownership. Bit worried about the phrasing there because that lends itself to maybe being interpreted in different ways than public ownership is. Maybe many of us would understand it. Workers' rights, green industrial revolution, no more illegal wars, defense of migrants' rights. There were a lot of pledges. Now, recently, we ended up in a pretty grim situation where the Tories were advocating hiking corporation tax and Labour were briefing that they opposed increasing corporation tax, in a clear violation of those pledges. And then they got themselves in a real mess over whether they supported changing the tax thresholds at the same time. So it became a story about what the hell does Labour think on tax. More broadly, I think it would be fair to say that summing up Labour's vision for the country is very difficult to explain. Whatever any of you think, however you voted in the leadership contest or didn't, or whoever you support, what wing of politics you're from, if you were going to honestly sit down now and sum up in a sentence, in a way you would on a doorstep if you knocked on someone's door to try and convince them to vote for the Labour Party, this is what Labour stands for. I think you would probably struggle if you're going to be completely honest with yourself without relying on platitudes and kind of management speak of a fairer country and things that no rational person would oppose. So I think that's one issue to talk about. Do they even have a vision for the country? Do they know what they want to do with power at all? Party unity, well, most of the left, of course, are no longer on the front bench, partly because Labour insisted on whipping to abstain on issues like the rights of undercover police officers to rape, torture and murder. Some just thought that was just a basic principle. They should not support giving the powers of undercover police officers to do those things. And more broadly, if we're going to look at electability, it's absolutely the case that polling went up very significantly to begin with when Keir Starmer became leader. His personal poll ratings were the best of any opposition leader since Tony Blair. That's a fact. Labour was 24 points or so behind after a terrible election defeat, and he brought, under his leadership in the first few months, Labour to basically level peg with the Conservatives. I suppose the caveat you already introduced there is Labour won 40% of the vote under Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and level pegged for the next 18 months. So basically, he took Labour back to where it was before January 2019, when Labour and the Tories vote both collapsed to the Brexit Party and to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens on the other side. The Tories clawed back their vote. Labour didn't, or didn't as much. And obviously that allowed the Tories to win their seismic victory in 2019. But what's happened since in the last few weeks is Labour's polling has fallen very markedly. So if we talk about Starmer's average approval rating, by June last year, 41% of people approved of his leadership and just 22% disapproved. Now, 33% disapprove and just 31% approve. Amongst Tory voters, his approval rate, and it's an important benchmark, that, because one of his pitches was to win over Tory votes. His approval rating amongst Tory voters is 21%. His disapproval rating is 47%. Average net approval ratings, Johnson now is on +3. Starmer is on -2, so he's less popular than the Prime Minister. Best Prime Minister average ratings, Johnson 42%, Starmer 28%, so there's a big gap. That's fallen. Back last September, Starmer was ahead on that. I'm using here, by the way, the brilliant pollster El Follen. Do follow them, Lefty Stats, on Twitter, because they bring together all of these statistics on whether he looks like a prime minister in waiting. Again, a very important benchmark, because looking prime ministerial, looking the part, was very much part of the Keir Starmer sell. And again, last June, 40% thought he did, 32% said he didn't. But now 52% think he doesn't look like a prime minister in waiting. Just 25% disagree. In terms of Labour 2019, people who voted for Labour in 2019, who I think we could all agree are core Labour voters, last June, 66% of people who voted Labour in 2019 approved of Keir Starmer, and just 8% disapproved. That's now 49% of them who approve. So less than half of the people who voted for the Labour Party in 2019 approve of Keir Starmer as leader. 24% disapprove. So there's a massive collapse in where that's headed. And in terms of Labour's headline polling, Labour's no longer level pegging, and in some polls is 10 points behind the Conservatives, and indeed has the same polling as Labour got in 2019, which I think we all agreed was a very, very bad result. So I suppose if we're looking at electability, if we're looking at the policies that he committed to, if we're looking at unity of the Labour Party, I don't think anyone looks at the Labour Party and thinks it's a united party. From the outset, it doesn't look great, does it? But we need to talk about this in detail. So I'm about to bring in our two brilliant guests about not just a whinge-a-thon. Nothing wrong with whinging, by the way. It's very therapeutic. Not just to whinge about it, but to proactively think, what next? What can the left do or say? There's obviously a big electoral test coming up in May in terms of local elections, Scottish elections, Welsh elections, the Hartlepool by-election. But in terms of, what should the left do? Can it meaningfully exert pressure on the leadership? Should it bother? Is Keir Starmer's leadership going to last? And I should say, privately, MPs and shadow cabinet members who are not on the left are privately raising the issue of Keir Starmer's leadership, as are union leaders, and openly discussing about whether he's going to last the year. It's a big fall from where he started. And there's already, again, the left, obviously, we're not happy, but increasingly rumblings of discontent are being heard in newspapers by those on the right of the Labour Party who are openly talking about their discontent and disillusionment with Keir Starmer's leadership. There's partly a shared critique, which is they don't know what he stands for. They don't know what his vision is. And the polling which has taken place in the so-called Red Wall, those are Northern and Midland seats, and also in Wales, which went from Labour to the Tory camp in the 2019 election, one of the big objections those voters have is they do not know what he stands for. And the old problem in politics is if you don't define yourself, your opponents will define you instead. And I should also note that Keir Starmer's collapse in approval ratings hasn't been accompanied with a full-bodied media onslaught against him, as Jeremy Corbyn, or to be honest, Ed Miliband, to a large degree, suffered. It's not like there's constant vicious headlines ripping apart Keir Starmer. There's mumblings of discontent which are being voiced, but you're not getting front pages of the Daily Mail and the Sun who are savaging Keir Starmer on a daily basis. That's just not a thing. The final point, I think, is about the pandemic, which is we have one of the worst death rates, worst death tolls, and consequently worst economic consequences, because a public health crisis is an economic crisis, on the face of the earth. One of the most catastrophic handlings of the pandemic, and the government have pretty much got away with it. The polling, I'm afraid, does show that. People are not convinced Labour would have done a better job. And I think, what narrative has Labour had on the pandemic about why it's gone so badly wrong, in all honesty? And instead, it does look like the opportunistic kind of Captain Hindsight critique has landed with a lot of people. I remember back in January when there was this, it was clear we were going to have a national lockdown. Labour couldn't bring themselves to support the closing of schools. They only U-turned 2 hours before the Tories did. So when you end up with a situation where, Labour basically, as I think Fraser Nelson in The Telegraph, a right-wing commentator, pointed out, it seems to be the strategy of working out where the Tories are going to end up on the pandemic and then just preempting them by a little bit. And that hasn't helped in terms of coming up with a critique of why we've ended up with one of the worst death tolls. And that's led a lot of people to conclude that the Tories had a bad hand, but, who'd want to be in their shoes and who could have done a better job when clearly we locked down repeatedly too late, messed up test and trace, reopened the economy too quick, every single time with the likes of Rishi Sunak, putting economic interests ahead of human life, which was always a false dichotomy, because if you mess up the pandemic, you mess up the economy, which is why we got the worst of all worlds. But Labour didn't make that critique, and here we are. That's enough of me babbling. Just before I bring in our guest, just a bit of housekeeping, as per usual. If you're watching this live, do click on the YouTube link to watch on YouTube. It just helps the show if you watch it on YouTube. Do press subscribe and also press the notifications bell, because that way you will get notifications. For those supporting us, supporting the team, we're doing another documentary, and those documentaries are made possible by your support on union wages. So thank you very much. Patreon.com/OwenJones84. That will, if you want to help come up with ideas of what documentaries we do, who we talk to, what issues we talk about, that's where we do that. You can also use Super Chat here to put questions to the guests and support the team as well as we do that work. And we will be doing lots of more documentaries in the coming weeks and months about a very, very broad range of topics. We've done everything from exposing companies who've profited from the pandemic. We've gone to anti-lockdown protests to investigate that phenomenon. We've done a documentary about how at every stage the Tories messed up the pandemic. That's all made possible by you. So thank you so much for all your support. And do like the video. If you like the video, good for the algorithm, other people watch it. Right, that's enough of me. Let us bring in our two fantastic guests, the commentator, Rachel Shabi, and Jess Barnard, the chair of Young Labour. We are very, very lucky to have both of you. Happy Easter and hello.
Hello, happy Easter.
Hi.
Do you know what?
Thanks for having us.
It's an honour. It's an honour. Let's start off. I don't know. I guess it's a year on. Where would you say Labour are currently at? Who wants to kick off with that? What's your general overall assessment of Labour's current plight and situation? Who wants to kick off? Jess, go on.
Happy to. Where are we though? That's the question, isn't it? Like, what do we stand for? And I think you kind of outlined it at the beginning. I don't think really many people can actually say at the moment what, Keir Starmer's Labour Party actually means, what we're going to fight for, what we've got to offer the country. And obviously, it goes without saying, it's a really difficult time, unprecedented times to be leader of opposition in a global pandemic. Obviously, it can't be a fun or easy job, but if you go to become the leader of the opposition, you don't expect an easy or fun job. And it just feels like, the Labour Party is just in complete disarray. And I can see why people are not moving towards voting for us, because it doesn't look like a party at the moment that is ready to take on the challenges that we're currently facing. And, I think the first year of Keir has been essentially defined by just chipping away at the left and dismantling those kinds of movements, and the passion and the socialist sort of wing of the party, by any means necessary, and backtracking on everything that Keir promised when he stood to become leader. And I think it's really disappointing as well, because when Keir was elected leader and he obviously won with a huge mandate, there were so many members who didn't vote for him but were really willing to get behind him and really hopeful that he would commit to what he had pledged, commit to the policies that we all supported and were really passionate about, that enthused so many people. A lot of trade unions were hoping that he would continue to work with them and solidify our relationship with workers' movements. And he's just completely failed in all of those areas. So I think it's really disappointing first year for Keir, and either it's a huge failing of his operation to define himself beyond trashing the left, or it's a huge success of a right wing outside of Keir's control who have got him to do the dirty work of trashing the left, getting rid of that threat, and now potentially they may look to remove him and replace him with someone who doesn't have the baggage of having trashed the left, and someone that they see as more able to communicate effectively some kind of message for what the Labour Party stands for and what their policy is. But time will tell, I guess, to see whether that was the plan all along or whether it is just incompetence. And obviously, if it is incompetence, that's pretty embarrassing for us when we've put so much on competency, when we talk about competency with the Tories, and we don't appear competent right now. So I think it's disappointing, really disappointing first year.
Rachel.
Yeah, I think Jess made some really important points there, and I think that's really interesting about the whole. Is Keir essentially the stalking horse of the right wing to pull the party in that direction and install a leader in that direction? But I think one of the main things with why it's been disappointing in the way that Jess described is that when he came in as leader, there was all this goodwill. I mean, Corbyn voters voted for him, and the ones that didn't, as Jess said, absolutely supported him in his endeavour, precisely because he set out his pitch on the basis of party unity and those 10 pledges, which were essentially, I mean, some people did point out at the time that they were pretty movable. They were not exactly firm, but they were signalling an absorption of the sort of left-wing economic arguments made in the 5 years of Corbyn's leadership. So I think that, all the people saying, poor Keir, he's had a tough time trying to establish himself in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, I have limited sympathy with that, which we can talk about maybe, but even on its own terms, the reality is that he inherited a party that was so united around him, that had so much goodwill for him being the unity candidate. And he completely failed on those terms. And I think we underestimate the importance of that, of how vital party unity is to a party that has been, over the last few years, so sort of toxically and self-destructively divided. And so it does now look like, when you look at the Labour leadership, it's like, yeah, all right, all you the sensibles, the moderates, the centrists, you've got your party back. But what on earth did you want it back for? What are you going to do with this power beyond having power for the sake of it? Or beyond, marginalizing the left, which seems to be, an end game in itself. What actually is the purpose of this power? And I think that's what voters are responding to as well. That's what the public is responding to as well, of what is it that you're for? What is it that you stand for? Who is it that you stand for? There's a sort of moral vacuum there to the leadership. And I think people can really smell that on the leadership, and it's part of the reason why it's doing so badly.
Yeah, I mean, Dara has messaged, is Keir simply a technocrat? And I suppose, Jess, I mean, one of the things, without getting too much into the personality stuff, but, I mean, it reminds me of this interview that David Cameron did before the 2010 election, when the editor of GQ, Dylan Jones, asked him, why do you want to be Prime Minister? And he didn't come up with because I want to change the country and do this or achieve that goal. He just said, because I think I'd be good at it. And I wonder if with Keir Starmer, that's kind of where he's at. He's big. He doesn't have a grand vision. He doesn't have a grand. He was someone in his youth who was involved in socialist politics, but that's a well-trodden path. But he's someone. He thought to himself, "Look, I've run this large organisation. I'm good at administrative stuff. Basically, having been in charge of the CPS, the British state is obviously a lot bigger than the CPS, but I know how to run things. I know how to pull levers. That's my kind of thing." And the problem, what that's joined to is, even though he himself, I think, by the way, doesn't see himself as a factional creature, a lot of the people around him who is appointed, they do see themselves as factional creatures. So Jenny Chapman is the head of his political operation, a former Labour MP. He's very much on the right. Matt Pound, who is the former national organiser of Labour First, which is what we would call the old Labour right, for those of you who aren't familiar with them. They love nothing less than ice-picking trots, and they regard trots as anyone to the left of Gordon Brown, as the leaked Labour report suggested. They don't mean people who believe in permanent revolution and revolutionary socialism. They mean basically people who are to the left of Brownite kind of iteration of social democracy. So yeah, that's my question, Jess. Do you think basically, I mean, it leads on to what you're saying, is this guy kind of a technocrat bureaucrat who just likes the idea that he thinks he'd be a good prime minister, who's surrounded himself with factional beasts who are filling a vacuum left by the lack of a coherent vision from the top?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is how he sees himself. I obviously see he painted himself as this non-factional, I'm here to unite everybody. But we quickly saw, the people he's chosen to surround himself with are on the right of the party. So I think, he has to be held responsible for his factional alliances and leanings and what he has done. But I do think you're right in that he sees himself as this just, competent, adults are back in the room. I can just get this job done. But the problem with that is that he is failing on being a technocrat. So when we look at the party machinery, just yesterday with his visit to a deeply homophobic church, where are the background checks? Where are all the procedures that should be in place for you to have this smooth running operation where you can make sure that you are not marginalizing people that you are supposed to represent and your membership? Thinking about our messaging and our graphics and things like that, we're really not getting our message across very clearly. And it's not just even about our messaging, like what is the Labour image, because it just seems to flip-flop all over the place at the moment. So if his whole pitch for becoming a prime minister is around being a technocrat that understands all this machinery, he needs to get his team together and he needs to focus on that. But he clearly isn't going to. So I do think we have to hold him to account with the factional alliances that he's making, while all this is going on. Also, on top of that, though, he really does not have his finger on the pulse with what's going on, because every time there's this movement, so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, and with the comments that he made, it's a moment, not a movement, and obviously the intention, we were told that Labour were going to abstain on the PCSE bill until the vigil of Sarah Everard. It just shows how much he is really not connecting with public mood or the potential backlash when Labour abstain on these really important issues of our time and authoritarian measures that this government's bringing in. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, as I said, what happens next and whether he's able to kind of create some narrative beyond I'm a technocrat.
I mean, Rachel, there's talk in the press of Peter Mandelson being brought in. Now, Peter Mandelson is someone who clearly very unapologetically, as opposed to the sorts of policies outlined in the 10 pledges Keir Starmer committed to in the leadership contest. I mean, also the polling, Peter Mandelson's polling is catastrophic. It's not like people in the Red Wall are thinking, do you know what? I was going to vote Labour, but they've not brought Peter Mandelson back. If they bring Peter Mandelson back, I might reconsider. What do you think that tells us? The fact, to go from I'm going to be a more competent version, basically, of Corbyn, which is basically his leadership pitch, to bringing in one of the architects of New Labour, who basically believes in putting the left permanently in a box from which a sealed tomb is how they phrased it, from which they can never exit. What's that telling us?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think this whole pitch of we're the competent ones and spending 5 years telling the Corbyn leadership, you're so incompetent. And now we look at their operation, it's like, you're not the competent guys, are you? Like, if that's not what competence looks like. So it's been quite extraordinary that the thing they were beating the left leadership over the head with is something that, they don't possess particularly. But look, I think it's it's a terrible twist of timing that in this pandemic, the precise moment when the sort of leadership that is required is one that understands the scale of the change required, as well as the appetite for change demonstrated. So all the public support and the polling that we've seen over the last year for things like, actually, yeah, we do want clean air. We do want the government to prioritise healthcare and well-being and perhaps a 4-day week, and definitely address all those terrible inequalities in this country along racial, regional and class lines and the intersection of those things. And the fact that the pandemic has ravaged us along those lines. So there's so much appetite for social justice and collectivism and a need for it in a post-pandemic world. And at that precise moment, that's the moment you choose to wheel in Peter Mandelson. I mean, it's just desperate in the disparity between what's needed and being signaled and what's actually being offered. And, this is a leadership that's stuck in a time warp that's, several decades old and does not remotely address the reality that we're in today. And actually, I think a big part of that is that disconnection from the grassroots, because it's a leadership that's not interested in the Labour left, and it's not interested in the grassroots of the party. It's not just that sort of attitude is undemocratic in terms of party democracy. It's that it's cut off its own blood supply, that life force, because we know that the people who are organising on the ground, have got engaged in all kinds of things, mutual support groups, food banks, providing hot food for NHS workers, mutual aid, NHS volunteering, all of that. Those are the people who are connected to the realities of what's going on in this country and what sort of hardships and need people are in. And if you as a leadership have cut yourself off from the grassroots, then you've also become incredibly disconnected to the realities that people are in this country. And I think that sort of ambiguity and hollowness is something that, is coming across in a really big way and is alienating voters in a really big way.
One of the things I think is interesting is, if we take a step back, so New Labour was obviously I don't support New Labour's brand of politics, but it was coherent and made sense at that historical juncture, in that you had the context of the defeat of the Labour movement in Britain, the smashing of the trade union movement. The left had been thoroughly marginalised by the 1990s. You had the kind of the post-Cold War kind of capitalist triumphalism, there is no alternative, the end of history. And you had this period of economic growth driven by a financial bubble, which obviously eventually burst with pretty catastrophic consequences. But at the time, infamously, Gordon Brown spoke of an end to boom and bust. But there was that sense of basically, there can be this political project that will take the proceeds of growth from the financial sector and redistribute it in more fair and progressive ways than the Conservatives, not least in expanding public spending. It was obviously combined with increased private sector encroachment into the public realm. But that's what they did. There was also kind of theoretical basis. I mean, lots of people don't realize New Labour Party came out of Euro-communism. There was the journal Marxism Today, which was associated with the Communist Party. A lot of New Labour's leading ideological lights came from that. And they had this idea of post-Fordism, the idea that the economy had changed and transformed from the Fordist model of factories, where you had an industrial working class built with communities based around workplaces where people often did the same job all their lives, and that changed and fragmented. So there was a basis to what they were saying and doing, and they did have ideas. I mean, a minimum wage, a windfall tax on privatized utilities, gay rights, devolution. So a kind of humanized Thatcherism kind of approach. And the Tories opposed those things. The Tories opposed the minimum wage and gay rights and devolution. Is the problem, I mean, do you not think the problem now is that brand of politics just isn't relevant to the here and now in a period of crisis? So if you look at Labour's sister parties, most of whom are led by people with that kind of politics, they've all collapsed, even worse than the Labour Party. And the problem is whilst it's true that a lot of Corbyn's opponents didn't spend the last few years trying to work out what they really believed, in a sense, what would they have come up with? I mean, that's why they're kind of left by promising to take or leave aspects of the left policies. We used to be the same. Before 2015, we were defined by what we were opposed. Stop the cuts, stop privatisation, stop war. But we didn't have any coherent sense for society we wanted to build. And the Corbyn project and the Sanders movement forced the left to think seriously about what their vision of society would be in the 21st century. That was a very long spiel. But what I'm wondering, Jess, is the problem is they are out of ideas, but that, of course, they're out of ideas. That's the historical period we're in. It's not like the 1990s with financialized growth. It's a period of very acute crisis. And the Tories have changed because the old Tories just, were very high Thatcherite ultras. These Tories are willing to be economically interventionist. So if Labour comes up with modest tinkering around the edges policies, the Tories go, we'll just take that and repackage it. What do you think?
Yeah, completely. They have really, really, I think, screwed this up completely, because they have defined themselves as people who are opposed to the left, right? Rather than actually people who are opposed to what the Tories have done to the country. And that's all that they've given us. What's quite interesting to watch is that when obviously Keir was pitching to become the leader of the Labour Party, was that he tried to appeal to all the people that believed in these things, right? So he committed to the policies that we had developed over the years of the Corbyn era, and he committed to all of those things that he said he believed in. But so did his supporters, and so, to be fair, did a lot of the right of the Labour Party. But what we're seeing now is this sort of daring shift for them to sort of be pushing back and say, oh, actually, no, we don't believe that anymore, or that's not fiscally competent. And we're sort of seeing this like New Labour kind of talk come back in. But like you said, what solutions is that providing us? If we're looking at, the results of like the outfall of like the COVID and pandemic and the jobs crisis, you've got huge, like millions of people facing unemployment. Young people are in the worst position in terms of employment that they've been in for decades. What are they offering to young people who have nowhere to go, like no jobs opportunities? They can't buy a house in their lifetime. They're being screwed over by their landlords. What are you saying to these people? And at the moment, it's nothing. And it feels like they don't want to dirty their hands with, what's seen as kind of too radical, and they see the downfall of our last election. It's like as the blame of like this Corbyn era where we like put forward solutions and we dared to dream things could be better. And it feels very much like they don't have anything and they don't dream that things can be better, and they want to remove themselves as far as possible from the ideologies or solutions to the problems that we are facing. So I really don't think that they have the solutions, and I think they spent the last 5 years wasted, scrambling around just to attack the left.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm trying to work out what a distinctive kind of New Labour program would look like in the here and now, which wouldn't just be appropriated and repackaged by the shape-shifting Tories under Boris Johnson? I mean, I just don't know what it would look like. But I mean, what do you think in terms of, Corbyn became leader because partly the intellectual and political exhaustion of all the other wings of the Labour Party, and it seems that there just hasn't been any attempt to address that basic fact.
Well, for one thing, I think that New Labour sowed the seeds of the current political destruction that we're witnessing. So certainly, on things like immigration policy, or also just failing to tackle the sort of rampant inequalities that were being set up, especially regionally, and as a consequence of deindustrialization and neoliberalism. I think that New Labour actually contributed to some of those problems that then sort of exploded in the form of Brexit and a sort of rightward tug for our political climate. So the problem now is that, for the last few years, the Labour leadership has been thinking quite seriously about, well, how do we tackle this? We've got a fundamental problem here of social injustice, and it's along devastating lines of inequality, structural inequality. And we do need to address that with redistributive economic policies. And we also need to think about creating a collective we that does not marginalize, demonize and scapegoat migrants and minorities, right? So they spent 5 years essentially building blueprints for that. Here's how we do this. If we want that as an end goal, here are the levers we push, here are the policies that we present to get there. And, this current leadership, instead of thinking, great, we've got all these policies that are ready made, they're good to go, someone else has already done the work for us, all we need to do is roll them out. Instead of thinking that, they've just dumped the whole lot. And it's just exhausting to watch the Labour Party go through these cycles of, no matter how often the polling says, actually, those policies are popular, the party goes, no, they were rejected at the polls. And it's just this fundamental misunderstanding of the political climate we're in and the kind of policies that are needed. And I think there's another piece here as well, which is to do with, this leadership has made this big deal of, because of the terrible defeat in 2019, which was terrible. But so they've sort of gone, oh, we've failed people. We need to get their trust back. We need to listen. We need to listen. And it's like, fine, but what is it that you're listening to? Who are you listening to? What happens if the person that you're listening to is spouting terrible nativist, nationalistic, far-right conspiracy theories, as happened to Keir Starmer when he was on, LBC radio a few months ago? What happens if that's what people are telling you? Are you going to confront that? Are you going to defang that? Because we are now in a political reality where that kind of sentiment has radicalized people. There has been a pull to the right. That's the political climate we're in. And unless you're the left that actively challenges that, all you are doing is facilitating it and making your own political fortunes less relevant in the bargain.
Before we talk about kind of stuff to do with the Red Wall and how that's talked about and the leadership's approach there, I mean, I do think the issue of competence is worth raising. In fact, just an example today, because competence was one of the big things. They were, look at our predecessors. We're going to be the grown-ups in the room. We understand how to run an opposition, etc. That was a big part of their pitch. So today, and George Eaton at the New Statesman's made this observation. So that the headline in the Observer is Starmer, I'll take my mask off and show why I should be PM. Now, this messaging is, I do think this is quite indicative of something, because as George Eaton says, Starmer's masked off line doesn't make political sense. It suggests he's been hiding his true self from voters, and he's been using the mask as slipped as an anti-Tory attack line. It's also questionable rhetoric during a pandemic. That to me is very obvious. That's like, if you were in a messaging meeting, you'd go, well, hold on. If we say we're taking the mask off, because obviously a mask off moment, you say that when someone has finally revealed their true self, which they've been trying to suppress. That's not a good image to convey. Obviously, we should be encouraging people to wear masks in a pandemic, so suggesting it's a positive to remove masks doesn't make sense either. So it sounds like you're admitting to deception about who you are. The point I'm making, that doesn't scream competence. But the other point is this weekend, and this is not just about competence, admittedly. So Keir Starmer went to a church which he used as a political campaigning video, which Theresa May had been condemned for explicitly 4 years ago for visiting, because of its anti-LGBTQ stance and specifically its support for conversion therapy, which is a form of torture against LGBTQ people. And the video remains up. They haven't apologized for it. Now, I actually happen to believe people, engaging with a range of different religious institutions, not all of whom have progressive views on a lot of things, is important. There's a difference between that and using something as a linchpin of your political campaigning video. And, LGBTQ Labour, who are just ridiculous, by the way, they're run by, I'll just say it, they're careerist hacks. They posted some mealy-mouthed statement in which they claimed they'd had an apology from the leader of the opposition's office, though that wasn't forthcoming when journalists approached the leader of the opposition's office. But again, they could have just Googled the church. It takes, literally, if you just Google the church, it comes up with Theresa May's being condemned for visiting the church. Again, I think there's a wider point about their relationship with minorities. The Labour Party has angered LGBTQ people over that, over failing to address rampant transphobia, over the fact they're putting forward a candidate for the Hartlepool by-election who went on a trip to Saudi Arabia paid for by the dictatorship and spoke about how progressive and great Saudi Arabia was. Saudi Arabia decapitates gay people. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement, calling it a moment, not dealing with alleged racism by Labour Party staffers against senior Black Labour MPs. And I'll talk to you about that, Rachel, because I know you've written a brilliant article about it. I mean, so there's the issue of competence, which they promised, but there's also just, it seems that they are completely tone deaf when it comes to minorities. They just don't seem to understand minorities at all. What do you think, Jess?
I think that they are letting their anger and obsession with the left, I think, cloud their judgment. They are so convinced that when we pull them up on these things, that this is like a factional attack or, whatever they want to construe it as. But actually, the reality is this is minorities speaking out about something that you have done as the party or as the leader of the party that is unacceptable, that undermines our rights, that makes us feel unwelcome within our own party. And we don't say, we don't want to have to be going out in, publicly saying, I have concerns about my own party's position on trans rights. Of course, we don't want to have to do that. We want the party to be leading on these issues. The Labour Party should be the natural home of marginalised communities, but at the moment it is not. At the moment we are pushing away marginalised communities because the leadership are so determined to undermine their calls for justice. And again, I think it's just part of this. We don't want to muddy ourselves with these, woke issues, and really, really quite awful characterization of these like red wall voters that they've kind of concocted in their heads, or that working class people don't care about these rights. Of course, there are LGBT working class people. I mean, what planet are these people living on? So I really don't understand why they haven't managed to grasp this still this late into Keir's leadership. Either it's down to deliberate in trying to isolate the left and position ourselves away from those kinds of politics, identity politics as they might call it, or like you said, it could be incompetent, in which case they need to have a real overhaul of the people in charge of these decisions, and they need to stop putting their head in the sand. I'm sorry, but the issue of transphobia is not going away in our party, and you being silent on the issue and allowing members of the Parliamentary Labour Party to be transphobic online, that's not going away. You need to address it, and that's what being a leader means. Even if sometimes it is convenient, even if sometimes it's not going to give you the headlines you want, you need to make sure that you are leading us in the direction and standing up for marginalised communities in the Labour Party. And, it just really concerns me that we are now putting out anti-masker pitches so we can manage that kind of stuff, but not anything else. It's just a really disappointing time. And, my heart goes out to everyone who has been affected by, our failures on issues and minority issues lately.
Rachel, what do you think? Because you wrote a brilliant article where you interviewed a range of people about this very specific issue.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jess. I think she put it so well there in terms of, it's actually, it's an obsession with factionalism and being not Corbyn. And so being not Corbyn means being not, woke, inverted commas, about things like equal rights for LGBT people and being a party that's free from discrimination. All of that is parked in the Corbyn basket, and therefore, that it's almost like an allergic reaction that the leadership has, and well, we need to do the opposite of that. And that was one of the heartbreaking things about, interviewing people across the Labour Party. So whether it was politicians in the PLP or councillors or members or staff, that feeling that anti-Black racism is just not being taken seriously by the party. It's being dismissed, it's being ignored, and to the extent that, it's creating an environment that's not safe for people, that feels really awful to be in, and the party just constantly underplaying it and dismissing it. And one of the big reasons for that, several of the people I spoke to mentioned this, was, well, they just see it as a sort of attack on the leadership from the left by proxy, that people are using complaints of racism to attack the leadership. And it was just so desperately painful to hear that in itself, but also, of course, it had that echo of, when people complained about anti-Semitism during the Corbyn leadership and then said that there was this assumption that they were attacking the leadership from the right. So it's like this cruel mirror that's gone on there. But I think that this drive to be not Corbyn has just put the party very much out of sync with just basic moral values and principles of the party. This whole mismanagement and misunderstanding of Black Lives Matter was so painful. It was such a jarring disconnect. It wasn't just that Starmer dismissed the movement as a moment. It was then, as just said, what he went on to say afterwards of describing the aims and the objectives of BLM as nonsense, which, to me is akin to saying, well, of course I support Palestinians in their cause, but why do they need to go on about the occupation so much? And why are we always wanging on about statehood and justice and equal rights? It's like, it felt like that. You can't support something and then dismiss as nonsense the demands, aims, the structural aims of that organization, which is what he did. And that is such a severe misunderstanding that I actually don't think that's incompetence. I think that's just a fundamental not understanding of structural racism and social justice. I just don't think that's where he or the leadership is at politically. And I think that's a huge problem, particularly given that we are in such a far-right nativist political climate at the moment.
Just a couple of other things. We've got about 10 minutes left. But OM gets Tom Levins, great name. Is Kieran Labour for shock in May when they realise the sheer amount of left-leaning votes they have lost? I guess, we do have these elections coming up in a month's time. And they're, as far as I know, the biggest set of elections outside of a general election since World War II, because elections were delayed last year, of course, because of the pandemic. So there's lots of electoral tests. I think everyone in the country gets the opportunity to vote. So it's quite a unique event. And I suppose, it could go either. It's difficult to know, actually, what will happen, because it is true, obviously, Labour is just now clearly significantly behind in the polls compared to the Conservatives. And, but then again, you could argue, well, in 2017, which is the last comparable set of elections, and that was a high point for the Conservatives, actually. They did very well in the local elections. You could argue in Scotland, the SNP's travails haven't helped the SNP. You could say in Wales, the Welsh government have very good approval ratings. The Labour administration, Mark Drakeford. In London, Sadiq Khan's going to absolutely smash that election. He might win on the first round. In Hartlepool, it's true a lot of people voted for the Brexit Party in 2019, but then again, they didn't vote for the Conservatives. It's not automatic that a lot of those voters will suddenly vote for the Conservatives if they didn't do that in 2019. Brexit's been done. The new Brexit Party under the reform, it's an anti-lockdown party, which most people just don't support in this country. It's a fringe issue. So you can actually see it's actually quite a lot of favourable ground. That said, if 2019 Labour voters, there's a big, massive disillusionment has set in, will a lot of those people come out and vote for the Labour Party? I suppose is another issue. So I'd be interested to know what you think is going to happen in those elections. But the other thing is, on the red wall issue, the so-called red wall, what strikes me is there is a caricature of the red wall which has been created and set up. I should point out, I don't think anyone in Keir Starmer's operation in any significant way grew up in those communities or knows those communities. They use focus groups at everything of the people who voted Tory from Labour in 2019. That's their substitute for having a vision. It's just, we'll just repeat back what we think those focus groups are telling us. And obviously, I think one of the problems that we have to grapple with, though, is what's happened in a lot of those communities is a lot of the younger people have left because of a lack of secure jobs and they've gone elsewhere. And older people have increased in number in those seats. And it's just a fact there's a bigger generational divide in voting than has ever existed in the history of democracy in this country. In 1983, young people voted for Margaret Thatcher. This idea of you're young, you're left wing, you become right wing, it's not borne out by the facts. Young people supported Reagan, and now they're more likely to support Bernie Sanders. Things have changed for material reasons. So I suppose, what do you think is going to happen in the elections? But what's your take on the whole strategy when it comes to the so-called red wall and how it's portrayed as this homogenous thing, and also why it's complicated? Because you do get people from quite insecure, who are people, working class voters who clearly defected to Tories. There's also higher rate of owner occupation in a lot of these areas, that often retired owner occupiers who are then just put into a working class box, whilst younger people in insecure work are excluded from being working class. What's your take, Jess, on the elections coming up and the way everything is seen through the prism of the red wall?
It's, it is pretty insulting caricature that is communicated at the moment. I'm really curious, as to what kind of coalition of voters we are trying to create at the moment, because it feels like the Labour Party is putting all of its money on appealing to this, working middle-aged white man who doesn't want to hear about trans rights, doesn't want to hear about anything else, angry about statues. That's what it feels like, right? But the reality is, working class communities are hugely diverse. This is something that I think that the leadership just do not understand. And like you said, they have these focus groups. Potentially, that is what they're using to, dictate their decision making. But they do not have the finger on the pulse of what is actually going on in these communities. And like you said, lots of young people having to leave to move to bigger cities to get job opportunities. Actually, if you start talking to a lot of these communities about building that infrastructure, the things that we talked about in the Corbyn area, and communicating that and making sure that you're making the case for supporting people's families to be able to stay in their local area and grow up and have their own families, whatever that might be. We aren't currently making any kind of case for that. We're not shifting any political ground. We're just basically saying, what don't you want to hear, and we'll just avoid that at all costs. And I also think, when it comes to the local elections, like we sort of talked about earlier, we touched on, what our message is. We're in a global pandemic. We've been told for months on end to stay at home, to kind of avoid this, unnecessary social contact. So we are now asking people to go out on voting day, go down to the polls where there'll probably be hundreds of people queuing, and put yourself potentially at risk to get out and vote Labour. But at the moment, why are we telling them to vote Labour? What what are they gaining from voting Labour? We haven't put that across to people. And I do feel a little bit sorry for, some of the local candidates who must just be trying to concoct like something and really, really heavily rely on like local agendas and local manifestos, because it sure as hell isn't coming from the Labour leadership. So I'm expecting that it'll be a really low turnout. In terms of young voters, I just cannot see young voters coming out in force to support the Labour Party at the moment. They haven't put forward any solutions for the crises that we are facing. They haven't been talking about the big issues that young voters care about, like environmental, climate justice. That's been completely absent from the leadership's narrative for a long time now. They really aren't engaging young people in the political system, and actually young people are turning away in their droves from parliamentary politics as a solution and looking to, as we've seen, take to the streets, take direct action, because it's the only way that they can see themselves being heard. So unless the Labour Party starts listening, young voters are going to keep turning away from them, and they are a hugely key part of a coalition for us to getting into government.
It's a really, really good point. I think that a lot of the political tumult of the last few years in this country and elsewhere has been because younger people's lives have become so insecure and difficult, and they're seeking alternatives to a status quo that doesn't benefit them. And those are the exact sorts of people being abandoned by the Labour leadership on the basis they have nowhere to go. And the Labour Together report actually said the one thing the Labour leadership should not do. The Labour Together report was done after the election by a range of Labour figures to work out what went wrong. And they said the one thing you don't do is take people who voted Labour in 2019 for granted, because Labour did that with Scotland, the Red Wall, and look what happened. That those younger voters are being taken for granted. You can see that. I mean, Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. Those voters are the ones that are being taken for granted. People in cities, ethnic minorities. Labour seems to think it's got those in the bank when it very clearly hasn't. And I think there's something about, the Turkish writer Ece Temelkuran put in her book, which is a brilliant book, How to Lose a Country. She wrote there that if your moral values aren't politically organized, then you end up feeling quite alone. And I think that's what's happened. So many people over the last year, including plenty of young people, have looked at the Labour leadership and thought, well, you don't reflect my moral values at all. But also, you've done it in the middle of a pandemic and a lurch to the right, where we're seeing the government, be incredibly authoritarian, increasingly so on many areas. And so, precisely at the moment when you need a political home or centre of gravity, the Labour leadership has decided not to be one. So, that is a terrible failing in and of itself, but especially when you consider how energised and mobilised young people were prior to this leadership. So during the Corbyn years, just how many young people got engaged with politics and who are now completely disengaged and put off by the leadership. I think that is a terrible failure, just on its own terms. But also, this whole narrative of, seeking to appease a mythical red wall, and it is mythical. This construct doesn't actually exist in reality. Many people have pointed out that there are, red and brown bricks in the red wall. It just feels like a very sort of disconnected, middle class, patrician way of approaching politics. But it's also that fundamental question of, are you going to watch the polls? As US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, are you going to watch the polls or are you going to move the polls? Are you going to be boxed in by the fact that the political class is pushing you in a rightward direction and is pushing the country in a rightward direction? Or are you actually going to challenge that and unpack that? Because until you do, you have zero political wiggle room. You are boxing yourself in, and that is just a road to ever diminishing votes and ever diminishing support, including from your own existing base.
Finally then, because I'm sorry, slightly overrun, so just a final one. What's the left strategy in all of this? And just by the way, on what you just said, Rachel, Gwynethid says, what strikes me is the centrist, anti-woke, anti-protest painting of the red wall demographic, was the Middle England demographic 10 years ago. So it's interesting how these things are reframed and reformulated. What's the left strategy? Can the left put pressure on the Labour leadership? Is there any point at doing so? Will it get any meaningful concessions? Are they even scared of us? I mean, they'll probably blame us for anything that goes wrong. People on Twitter criticising Keir Starmer apparently can transform Labour's electoral prospects. But also, you know, I mean, is Keir Starmer's leadership going to last? I mean, what do you think, Jess? What happens next, basically?
I mean, you know, they've done an incredible job at trashing the left. You know, if there is one thing that they've been pretty effective at, it's been that. So you have to hand it to them. It's been one of the fastest, most brutal operations I think we've seen in the Labour Party of the treatment of the left. And they've kind of done it in a drip feed way. So, you know, the suspension of Corbyn, the treatment of CLPs, the whipping to abstain on bills that they know that the left are really passionate about, suspending front benches from the left, not suspending the people who, you know, said that they hoped a young left-wing member died in a fire in the leaked report. All of these things, they've kind of drip fed us to, I guess, create this discontent where we are seeing the left leaving the party, but also kind of splintering in its strategy, right? So we've got those on the left that are saying, no, it's not worth it, leave, get out, you can't associate yourself with this. And then you've got those that are saying, you know, stay and fight. So I am a supporter of stay and fight, but what does that actually mean? Because there's no point saying that if you don't actually have a plan for what that looks like. I think we really need a coherent and a collective of people working together from across the party. I think too often the left looks to PLP representatives from the Socialist Campaign Group to kind of lead us, which is against everything we believe in, really. You know, they're there to represent us, and it should be us, the grassroots movements, the membership, that leads this movement and this pushback, and holds the party to account, and eventually, you know, elect more socialist people, working class people who can represent the values and the things that we need to see, the societal change that we need to see. So I think our strategy really does need to be building that grassroots movement, returning to the kinds of, you know, like working class organising in our workplaces, and making sure that we are doing the work behind the scenes to put across our platform for change, because we have that, right? That we don't need to go away and work on what our solutions for the current situation now, because we have that. We know what we're trying to achieve and we know what society needs. So we need to find a way to communicate that and build our base back up and work together on this, because obviously it's a really difficult time. People are really disenfranchised, but we've got to find a way to motivate and encourage people to fight back.
What do you think, Rachel? What next?
Yeah, I think that's a really sound analysis. It is, my sense of this current leadership, and Starmer or not, definitely the people around him, is that they actually are almost physically allergic to anything that comes from the left. You know, it is that deeply factional. It really is, you know, such a fatal problem in the party and the sort of seed of its own destruction, so that anything at all that comes from the left is ignored because of where it's come from, regardless of whether it has any merit or not. I think that's the leadership we're currently dealing with. And so I don't feel that enthusiastic about things that can be done in sort of parliamentary party terms. I also think that we're in this for quite a long haul as well. It's not going to be a quick fix. But one of the things, quite a few things give me hope. Not least the incredible demonstrations that we've seen over the last year over the police bill that's, you know, the authoritarian police bill that's working its way through Parliament, but also Black Lives Matter. So much, the rentier strikes, there's been so much direct action and political organising from people who have not let go of that momentum that the left had. Just because the leadership has changed. So that gives me a lot of hope. But the other thing is that when you talk to people at grassroots levels, so whether it's community organisers or local councils or, you know, someone at that sort of level of organising, one thing that always comes up is there is an appetite for collectivism. People want to help. The pandemic has shown people coming up and saying, I do want to help. I want to help my community. I want to support local businesses. There's been an articulation of that sentiment for collectivism, which is the backbone of Labour left transformative policies. It's that principle of universalism, don't ask who deserves it, everyone deserves it. That's sort of Howard Zinn thinking of universalism. Everyone deserves clean air, housing security, decent job security, good health. There's been an articulation of that. And I think that the work now over the next few years is really building that muscle memory of collectivism that there is a desire for in this country, and just to cohere it around some kind of political organization. That sort of work, I think, is already beginning, and I think is actually going to be incredibly impactful.
Guys, that was brilliant. We are very lucky to have wisdom and insight of this level from both of you on Easter as well. So thank you so much. Particularly, it's actually quite sunny outside, so do escape this to soak it cold. I mean, it's cold, but seriously, that was absolutely fantastic, and we're very honoured to have you both. People, whether you're watching live or listening to the podcast, do follow Rachel Shabi and Jess Barnard on twitter.com, because you can read their insight for free. Literally don't have to pay for it, just there, whenever, on whatever subject. So thank you, both of you. It's been a big honour, and I look forward to seeing you soon in real life, IRL.
Thanks so much for having me on, Owen. It's great to see you. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Thanks, Owen.
Cheers, Jess. Thank you, everybody, for joining, whether you're watching live or listening to the podcast. That was very, very good, as ever. We are very lucky to have such a top-notch quality of guests on this show. Before I sign off, if you're watching live, do like the video and subscribe. Liking helps the algorithm, so more people watch it. And for those supporting us on Patreon, so we have a team, we can do stuff like documentaries. Thank you so much. And you decide the documentaries we do, which have all been great ideas. Patreon.com/OwenJones84. We're looking to do a documentary, looking at the moment about the reality facing young trans people. We've just done one about companies profiteering from COVID-19 and the reality of what their workers are going through. So huge appreciation for that as well. We've got lots of interviews coming up. We've got lots of shows coming up. So do subscribe to the channel and give us 5 stars on the podcast. Again, that encourages more people. Just finally, though, all I would say is, I saw this the other day. It's like, by undermining Keir Starmer, that's going to help the Conservatives. Often from people who spent years attacking and demonising the Labour leadership under Jeremy Corbyn for the most ridiculous things possible. And, I think the point I'd make there is, Labour's, it's not, individual lefties like myself do not have the power of the combined might of the British media, which relentlessly went for the Labour Party for those few years. Labour's approval ratings, polling ratings haven't fallen because people on the left have pointed out the shortcomings of the Labour leadership. They've fallen because of the shortcomings that are being pointed out, and they are real and profound. This is a Labour Party, which I do not think in the history of the Labour Party, a leadership has been so lacking in any coherent vision. New Labour had a vision, and lots of Labour leaderships in the past, who I might not agree with, had a clear vision of what they wanted to do with power. And this lot don't, but they are full of people who definitely know what they don't want, and that's the left to have any role whatsoever within the Labour Party. They want the left out. And I would warn people that in the coming months, particularly if it doesn't work out well in the May elections, I think what will happen is a heightened onslaught against the left. I think Peter Mandelson being brought into the tent will be part of that. I think whatever's going on currently in Liverpool with allegations, very, very important to point this out, allegations of serious corruption in the Liverpool Labour Party, but all of this is going to be spun out in ways which will be used by the Labour leadership to further attack and marginalise the left. That's the only thing they seem to have in an otherwise empty cupboard. And I think the left needs to talk about what his strategy in that context is, because the problem, as I keep saying, is the Labour leadership are bereft of ideas and a coherent vision. They don't have answers to the crisis of social democracy, which is across Europe. The only places where the so-called centre-left are in power is where they have made accommodations with the left. In Spain, the Labour sister party are in coalition with Podemos. In Portugal, they made a pact, the socialists with the radical left. Denmark as well. In America, again, Joe Biden didn't spend his time demonizing the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democrats. He took them on as partners. And didn't demonize them as Bernie bros, like I would say the Clinton wing definitely did do. They were brought in. A lot of the policy agenda has been, adopted because of the left of the Democrats. If they're gonna, if Keir Starmer's faction or the people around him are determined to wage a ceaseless, remorseless war against the left, and as we can see, their approval ratings amongst people who voted for Labour in 2019 and amongst younger people are in free fall, then I don't think they're interested in power, not in any rational sense in any case. So we need to make these arguments, but I think the other point I would just end on is it's not all about what happens within the Labour Party. What we're seeing are extra parliamentary movements rising, BLM, Overkill the Bill, for example, the climate justice movement. And one way of putting pressure on the Labour leadership and the Labour Party, whether or not you want to be in the Labour Party or not, and that really is up to you, by the way, clearly, is what people do on the streets, organising and fighting. And it is those younger people younger than myself, I'm 36 after all, who give hope, because they're the ones who know that they have that the status quo, which gives them nothing, needs to be replaced. And they're the ones who are committed unequivocally to fighting for the rights of minorities, who many in the Labour leadership feel should be thrown under a bus for electoral gain. And I think those younger people are a generation which should give all of us hope, and that should give us reasons for optimism. And in the coming weeks and months, as lockdown hopefully eases and some form of normality can return, those movements will only grow. And I think that is where a lot of what happens in politics will be decided on the streets, not in Zoom calls, in private meetings in Westminster, in SW1, in think tanks amongst advisors, but by people organising on the streets and forcing the powerful to listen to them, which is the only way we've ever won our rights and freedoms in the history of this country. Thank you, everybody. As ever, I said, please do subscribe, press the like button, support us however you want. We've got loads coming up. Thanks to your support, so we really appreciate it. Happy Easter. Enjoy the sun. I'll see you soon.